business negotiations aren't actually so much about the bluff, which would be complete misdirection. You would do that more in something like options trading, where you can put a small play on the opposite side of where you want to go in order to move a market, for example. So you can do that when bluffing really works well when you've got almost like a zero-sum situation going on, right? Where one player can win and one player will lose, and that's kind of the way that it has to be. Bluffing is not actually that productive in a win-win situation, which is a lot of what you want to be doing in business, is a win-win as opposed to a zero-sum, because that's a good long-term strategy in business. What you do more in business is more about hiding your position, not allowing your opponent to know what your position is in terms of, for example, in negotiations, not letting them know, for example, what your deal break point is, and not giving them that away. So the kind of bluff that you would be doing would really just be about if you want to make sure that you're getting the best deal possible for yourself, it would be about not letting your opponent know what your bottom line is or where you can break on the deal, and keeping that information very hidden and convincing them that you're either willing to go higher or lower than you actually are, so that their break point will be higher than it might have been or lower than it might have been. And that's really more where the bluff goes. I think that we think of bluffs a little bit differently. So in the zero-sum situation, you're going to see more like pure bluffs as opposed to keeping your cards close to the chest, which is not really a bluff. That's a little bit different. I think that, again, that goes back to keeping your cards close to your chest so that they don't know what you want them to not know what your ceiling or your floor is, depending on which side of the negotiation you're on, right? And that's extremely important. I think that the other thing another thing that's really important is to get your opponent to go first. You should do anything in your power to get your opponent to have to offer first. It's actually extremely important in a negotiation. Whatever you can do to get that to happen is really important, because when you negotiate second against a first offer, you're always going to do better in the long run in that negotiation, because they're setting a price for you, so you already know what their range is, as opposed to having to guess at their range, which is extremely important. The other thing that I would say as far as really being successful in negotiation is you need to go into negotiation understanding if it's a deal that you're willing to break or a deal that you're not. And that's extremely important, because if it's a deal that you're willing to break, then you should be willing to break it. In other words, you should say to yourself before you go in, this is the price I want, or this is the price I want to pay. And if I can't get this, then I will walk away. And kind of set that limit for yourself before you walk in, so that you don't get caught up in the negotiation and accept something that you wouldn't otherwise have in order to not to break the deal. You need to know before you walk into the room, is this something that you're willing to break? Because whenever we're willing to break it, we're always negotiating from a much stronger position, because people get emotionally invested in the outcome of the negotiation. It's interesting because it's within the rules of the game, opponents are expecting you to be misleading, right? Or at least to try to be misleading. So there aren't any bad long-term consequences to that behavior, because it's considered to be a rule of the game. And in fact, there are mostly, if you're applying the deceptive moves, that's more, I'd rather not call it deception, but deceptive moves or deceptive plays. If you're applying those properly, it's actually only up equity, because you're serving to confuse your opponents, which is most of what you want to do. You don't want your opponents to think that every time that you check, which is passing the action, that you're weak. Every time that you bet, you think you have the best hand. Like, that would be really bad, because it would be very easy to develop a strategy to play against you. So you have to keep your opponents kind of on their toes, not knowing exactly what you have. It's part of the rules of the game. And so there's a lot of up equity to behaving in a way that causes your opponents not to be able to read your intentions well, and not to be able to read your hand well, which only comes from doing some bluffing, which is part of the rules of the game. But there aren't any long-term issues in terms of your downside in terms of your interactions with your opponents. I think it's different in the business world. I think that in general, deception in the business world can be very counterproductive, unless it's specifically just about keeping your cards close to your vest. But out and out lies to business associates, if you want to continue to have a productive relationship with those people, I think in general are very counterproductive, unless it's kind of built into the rules of the game. So you can go back to something that's like options trading, which is very much a zero-sum game. People understand that it's expected as part of the rules of the game that people might put out false positions. So it doesn't really matter if your opponents are pissed off about that or anything like that, because they're truly opponents. It's a zero-sum situation. The problem is that in most business, you're not talking about zero-sum. You're trying to create win-wins so that you have long-term relationships and long-term successful relationships. And if everything that you do is about getting the last penny or misdirecting or lying in order to get an edge, you won't have successful long-term relationships with those associates. And I think that in the end, while in the short run, you might end up with a little bit extra, in the long run, you're going to end up with a lot less. So I don't think it's a very good trade to be generally deceptive. And I can tell you that in personal relationships, it's really ugly, because you will get caught. Unless we're talking about white lies, like, honey, does my ass look fat in these jeans? It's probably a good idea to say no, regardless of what the real answer is. But those are important social lies that keeps relationships going well, because they're not particularly important questions, right? But on the important questions, you shouldn't lie.